I call the honourable member Sue Moroney.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise and speak to the first reading of the Education Amendment Bill number 4. And I was, Mr Speaker, very excited when I saw this tabled in Parliament just last week, because I thought maybe the government was going to do something about the shambles it's created in education. Maybe I thought this is the time that they'll actually introduce legislation to reverse the funding cuts that they meted out to the early childhood education sector at the last budget in May 2010. I thought maybe that's what they were amending about the Education Act, but I was disappointed to find that that's not the case. Perhaps it could have been their opportunity to realise that they have made an absolute shambles of the national standards in the primary school sector, and maybe the amendment to the Act was going to actually address that critical issue in the country. But no, I was disappointed on that front as well. Perhaps the government had realised, perhaps the minister had realised that it wasn't okay to try and resolve the very serious bullying issues going on in our schools at the moment by just sending a letter to schools. And in fact, perhaps the minister had actually all along been working on a legislative approach to this very big problem that is facing particularly our secondary schools at the moment. But no, that's not to be addressed in the Education Amendment Bill number 4 either. I wondered if in fact this bill might retrospectively realise from the government benches that cutting funding to adult and community education was a big mistake as well. But no, this bill wasn't to recognise that issue. Perhaps, I thought, as a last-ditch attempt, that maybe, just maybe, this government had realised that during the recessionary times, this was the very best time to allow New Zealanders wanting to actually get that step up in their lives to access a tertiary education when they didn't have the opportunity to do that at any other time. And that the government could do that by lifting the cap on tertiary institutions, investing in skills development for this country's future. But I was to be disappointed on that front as well. Because, Mr Speaker, I think this is very much a lost opportunity, because the Education Amendment Bill number 4 could have been addressing the significant issues at the heart of this country's problems going forward for the future, because that, of course, is what education is about. It is our opportunity, our best opportunity for this country to build its future going forward, and sadly this bill doesn't address any of those issues. But what more can you expect from a government whose goal, it seems, is to lower wages in this country as a tactic, as a strategy? Bill English is now telling this country that he's deliberate about having wages 30% lower in New Zealand than they are in Australia, because he thinks that gives our country a competitive advantage. Having lower wages is going to give us a competitive advantage. Well, that's not the vision for this country on this side of the House. I can inform listeners to this debate of that very fact. And that's why I was worried but not surprised to see that the government has once again failed to take an opportunity by introducing an Education Amendment Bill to actually do something that would make a difference in terms of lifting the living standards in this country, lifting people's opportunities to get the very best education, and they have missed that opportunity with this amendment bill to address those very substantial issues. However, the issues that are in front of us with this amendment bill, Mr Speaker, I will say that Labor is prepared to support 2 select committee so that we can hear how the public actually does respond to this. And I'm pleased to say that we're getting to hear from the public this time, because we never ever heard from the public on national standards, and look at the shambles that that's turned out to be. Turned out to be a complete shambles, because not one parent, not one teacher, not one student got to actually, or not one Board of Trustees member got to come to this Parliament and say what they thought about the concept and the principle or the legislation around national standards. They never got that opportunity, and therefore we have the shambles that is in front of us now with national standards, a complete and utter shambles, and it started from that. And just this weekend, actually, 750 principals voted no confidence in that government's education policy, and oh yes they did, Mrs Goodhue, they absolutely did. No, they voted no confidence in the education policy of the government, and they voted no confidence in the leadership given by the Minister over the introduction of national standards. And if the government haven't heard that, if they are in denial about that, then they do not listen, and they are completely out of touch with what is happening in the education sector. They don't want to hear from the leaders of the school communities, the principals up and down the country, 750 of them, unprecedented. For the first time ever, that Principals Federation said no confidence in that government's education policy, and I think it's a great shame that the government members opposite are shaking their heads because they either haven't heard it or they don't care. They either haven't heard it or they don't care, and that's how out of touch they are with the current issues facing the education sector. This bill, however, Mr Speaker, does actually introduce some positive changes, not the changes that we really need to see to our education system, but nonetheless a little bit of tinkering around the edges, and that is what this government tends to do. We would like to hear the views of the sector on those changes. We do support the creation of a new Crown agency to cover export education, because that's a vital part of our economy, and it does need to be properly managed and it needs to be fostered. We do approve of the introduction of stricter rules around the registration of private training establishments. That's also welcome from Labor, but we're keen to hear what the sector has to say on that. Not just the sector. Well, by saying the sector, I guess my definition of the sector is those who work in the industry and those who use it. So we want to hear from the students, we want to hear from the families of the students, we want to hear from the training providers themselves. The private training industry is an important part of the tertiary sector, and cases of qualification selling and falsifying results do harm to both that sector, it does harm to students, and it does harm to New Zealand's reputation. So we look forward to actually supporting the aspects of this bill that will help to resolve that and tidy that up. But look, here's the real doozy to do with this bill. Student levies. This government now wants to pretend that it wants to sort something out about the huge increase in student levies that have happened under its watch, under that government's watch, in tertiary institutions up and down the country. But here's the real joke. The right hand doesn't know what the right foot is doing, because in another bill coming from the ACT party but supported by the government, they're actually making institutions pick up more and more student services by getting rid of the student unions that provide those services now. They want those student unions to go down the tubes, the student support services they provide will go with them, and the institutions will be left to pick that up. But this bill comes into place to say don't those institutions even think about increasing levies to students as a result. We know that they won't get any increased funding from that government, so what are they to do? Student services are going to decrease and students will be the poorer for it.
That's right. I call Joe